Have you ever wondered why modern society feels less like a platform for high-risk innovation and more like a padded, pastel-colored daycare center?
Oh, that is such a perfect way to put it, a daycare center.
Right. I mean, you look around at the way our institutions operate today.
Right.
The constant surveillance, the endless safety mandates.
Trigger warnings.
Exactly. The trigger warning. And the HR department's just policing every single interaction.
Right.
And you really have to ask yourself, how did we get here?
Yeah, when did we actually transition from a culture that, celebrated the rugged pioneer
To one that demands a comprehensive safety net for literally every conceivable human interaction.
It's a profound shift. Honestly, it's almost dizzying if you step back and look at the historical timeline.
It really is.
We're living in an era that actively pathologizes the very traits that built Western civilization in the first place. Risk, stoicism, unapologetic competence.
Right.
These are increasingly treated not just as outdated, but as active threats to public safety.
And that profound shift is exactly what we are going to unpack today. But before we jump into the deep end, please take a second to like and subscribe to the show.
Yes, please do.
Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you these really highly detailed, custom-tailored deep dives. And today's mission is, well, it's an intense one.
Oh, it's massive.
We are reviewing an explosive, ultra-long, incisive, and frankly fascinating new ebook. It's titled Safety Industrial Complex: Seatbelts for Motorbikes, Safetyism, and Taxing Risk by Conrad Reicher.
It's quite a title.
It is, and I'm telling you right now, you're going to want to read this for yourself. Go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book, and make sure you follow the author on Substack at Conrad Reicher.
It's a text that truly pulls no punches. I mean, it's a sweeping, highly provocative diagnosis of our current cultural and political landscape.
Definitely.
It looks specifically at the architecture of our institutions before they were fundamentally altered.
It really does. And to set the stage for you, this listener, today's deep dive is custom tailored specifically for you. We are delving into content that has become incredibly popular within the men's rights and red-pilled manosphere communities.
Right, it's really resonating there.
Yeah. The core focus here is understanding the history of our institutions. How they were originally built, how they historically functioned on principles of merit and risk.
And then how, according to the author's argument, they were subsequently captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Exactly. And because of the nature of that argument, we need to establish our parameters very clearly today.
We absolutely do. This is critical.
Listen carefully, because this is our crucial impartiality statement. The source material we're covering today contains highly polarizing, intensely politically charged content.
Very charged.
It directly targets left-wing, feminist, and progressive ideologies. And I want to make it explicitly, emphatically clear to you listening, neither of us sitting at these microphones is taking sides.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our role today is strictly as neutral guides. We are here to impartially report, deconstruct, and unpack the controversial arguments contained in Conrad Reicher's original text.
Right, so that you can fully understand the mechanics of his overarching thesis.
Exactly. We are just dissecting the anatomy of his argument.
And the mission of this deep dive is to deconstruct Reicher's core premise that Western civilization is currently suffering from a spiritual and cultural autoimmune disease.
Right, which he calls safetyism.
Yeah, safetyism. He argues that this relentless pursuit of absolute emotional and physical safety is actively destroying competence, liberty, and, well, the traditional male roles that originally built society.
So, to really grasp how Reicher views modern governance, we have to look at the book's title and its central jarring metaphor: seatbelts for motorbikes.
It's such a striking image.
It really is. He paints this picture of a safety bureaucrat, sitting in some office in Brussels or Washington, D.C.
Safe behind a desk.
Right. And this bureaucrat is looking at a spreadsheet of traffic fatalities and comes up with what they think is just a brilliant idea. We need to weld a 5-point harness seatbelt onto a Honda Fireblade motorcycle.
It's a terrifying mental image, honestly. But it serves as the governing metaphor for his entire thesis. Because if we look at the actual physics of riding, a motorcycle is fundamentally a machine of pure purpose.
Yeah.
It requires a pact with reality. You are exchanging a certain level of physical vulnerability for extreme agility and freedom.
Because if you crash a motorcycle at 70 miles per hour without a seatbelt, The physics dictate that you separate from the machine.
Right, you have to separate.
You tumble, you slide, your leathers take the friction, you might break some bones, but you actually have a statistical chance of survival because you are shedding that massive kinetic energy away from a 400-pound block of tumbling steel and hot exhaust.
Exactly. But if you strap the rider to the bike, as Riker points out, you guarantee a fatality.
100%.
The rider becomes inextricably tethered to the crushing weight of the machine. So the seatbelt transforms a highly dangerous but potentially survivable accident into a guaranteed catastrophic event.
Wow.
And what this symbolizes for Riker is the very definition of safetyism. It is a top-down solution invented by disconnected bureaucrats who fundamentally do not understand the mechanics or the soul of the system they're trying to regulate.
They transform calculated, manageable risk into catastrophic certainty.
Precisely.
He traces this specific type of bureaucratic overreach to an archetype he calls feral maternalism, or the terrible mother. And this is where the psychological profiling in the book gets incredibly sharp.
Oh, yeah, he really digs into the psychology here.
He argues that this bureaucratic smothering isn't just the government being annoying or inefficient. He views it as a repressed maternal instinct.
Right.
It's an energy that, lacking biological children to actually nurture and raise to independence, just metastasizes. It turns into this overwhelming bureaucratic impulse to swaddle adult citizens and regulations.
Essentially treating the entire adult population as permanent infants who just can't be trusted to manage their own lives.
The pathology he diagnoses here is crucial because the healthy maternal instinct wants to prepare the child for the harshness of the world.
Yes.
The terrible mother archetype, however, doesn't want to prepare the child. She wants to pad the world so the child never has to face it at all.
And Riker provides some chilling real-world examples of this exact mentality actually costing human lives. The most striking is his analysis of the UK's Smart Motorways initiative.
Oh man, this was a massive, tragic controversy.
It really was.
So, for you listening, the UK Department for Transport decided to remove the hard shoulder, the emergency breakdown lane, and turn it into a permanent live traffic lane. The stated goal was to reduce congestion and emissions without having to physically widen the highways.
The theory, drawn up in a safe, climate-controlled office, probably sounded wonderfully progressive and efficient to them. They believed they could manage the risk with overhead cameras and digital speed limit signs. But the mechanical reality was that they removed the only physical safety valve in a high-speed system. Riker points to the government's own horrific data, which showed a 216% increase in live lane breakdowns after this so-called smart innovation was implemented.
A 216% increase. That's insane.
Motorists whose cars suffered mechanical failures or flat tires were suddenly stranded in active 70-mile-per-hour traffic with literally nowhere to pull over.
And what blows my mind is the bureaucratic response when people called in a panic. The emergency dispatchers, following protocol, told these stranded drivers to stay inside their vehicles.
Advice that proved fatal. Commercial transport trucks simply couldn't stop in time. People literally burned alive in their crushed cars.
Just horrible.
Riker's point is that the bureaucracy that created this absolute death trap issued press releases celebrating reduced travel times and theoretical efficiency.
They prioritized a top-down model of smart safety over the brutal, unforgiving reality of physical danger.
Exactly. The bureaucrat felt virtuous, while the citizens paid the ultimate price.
He gives another example that operates on an even larger global scale, the European Union's precautionary principle.
This one is staggering. The precautionary principle essentially states that if a new technology might theoretically cause an unknown harm, it must be banned or delayed indefinitely until it can be proven absolutely 100% innocent.
Which is impossible.
Exactly. Riker applies this framework to the tragedy of golden rice. This was a genetically modified grain engineered back in the early 2000s, specifically to produce beta-carotene, which is the precursor to vitamin A.
Okay.
It was designed entirely to combat vitamin A deficiency in the developing world.
A deficiency that, according to the statistics Riker cites, blinds up to 500,000 children every single year and kills hundreds of thousands of them. It's a massive humanitarian crisis.
But because of the precautionary principle, lobbied for heavily by organizations like Greenpeace, who feared unknown theoretical ecological risks of GMOs, the deployment of golden rice was stalled. It was delayed for 20 years. Riker notes that a conservative estimate suggests 8 million children went blind or died waiting for bureaucratic permission for a crop that posed no actual threat other than to the ideological purity of the anti-GMO movement.
8 million children.
Yeah. He argues this is the feral maternal instinct operating on a civilizational scale. It demands absolute zero-risk proof of harmlessness, and in doing so, it becomes a delivery system for mass casualties.
Because the safety bureaucrats feel morally superior for preventing a theoretical harm, while completely ignoring the millions of actual deaths their delay caused.
Exactly.
Let me throw an analogy at you, just so we can map this onto everyday life. Think about a helicopter parent who padlocks a neighborhood playground because they're terrified their kid might scrape a knee on the jungle gym.
Right.
The parent locks the gate and feels they've succeeded because the knee is safe today. But the downstream effect is that they end up creating a teenager with zero motor skills, no spatial awareness, and massive anxiety.
Because that child never learned how to navigate physical space or assess heights or, take a fall.
Exactly. But let me push back on Riker's framing here. Is the author arguing that all safety regulations are inherently destructive? If I'm listening to this, I might think, well, I like FDA drug trials and I like building codes so my roof doesn't cave in. Is he targeting all regulation or just a specific type?
That is a vital distinction, and Riker is very careful to address it. He differentiates deeply between what he calls masculine actuarial risk and the feminine hive mother archetype.
Actuarial risk.
Yeah. Actuarial risk is cold, mathematical, and grounded in reality. It is the understanding that life inherently requires risk, that expected values can be calculated, and that acceptable trade-offs exist.
So the actuary knows you put rebar in the concrete to prevent the roof from collapsing.
Right. But the actuary also knows that trying to eliminate all risk from society means eliminating all progress, all innovation, and eventually all life.
Because zero risk means zero movement.
Exactly. The hive mother archetype, however, operates entirely on emotion and anxiety. She demands absolute protection regardless of the civilizational cost.
She can't tell the difference between a risk worth taking and a danger worth avoiding.
Precisely. She can't distinguish between letting a child climb a tree to build confidence and playing in traffic. She wants to pad the cell until it becomes a coffin, as he puts it.
Wow, a coffin.
Riker actually relies on the concept of fragility coined by Nassim Taleb here. Systems that are constantly deprived of stressors do not actually become safer. They become incredibly brittle. They accumulate massive hidden risks.
Like a forest fire.
Yes, exactly. The forest that is never allowed to have small natural brush fires eventually accumulates so much dead wood that when a fire finally does start, it burns the entire ecosystem down to the bedrock.
Right.
Safetyism, in Riker's view, is the systematic accumulation of catastrophic tail risk, all hidden under the warm, fuzzy banner of risk elimination.
So if the state is acting as this smothering feral mother, how does this mother view the citizens she is supposedly protecting? This takes us into the psychological framing of the book, what Riker calls the grammar of the left.
Yeah, this is fascinating.
He argues that modern institutions divide the world into two very strict, unyielding categories.
He claims that leftist ideology and the institutions it has captured operates entirely on a binary linguistic and moral grammar. Every individual, every demographic, and every action is categorized as either the infant or the predator.
Let's define those terms exactly as the text lays them out. The infant represents the vulnerable, the supposedly oppressed, the marginalized.
Right.
This category is viewed by the state as inherently innocent, devoid of agency, and requiring constant state protection, validation, and resources.
And then you have the predator.
Exactly. The predator represents competence, traditional masculinity, independence, and resilience. This category is viewed as inherently guilty, dangerous by default, and requiring state suppression, strict regulation, and heavy taxation.
And the mechanism that enforces this binary is what Riker terms gynocentric epistemology.
Okay, let's unpack that word for the listener.
Epistemology is simply the philosophical study of how we know what we know. It's the framework for defining truth. In the classical Western tradition, epistemology is based on the logos, the masculine principle of objective truth, empirical data, the scientific method, and logical syllogism.
So if I drop an apple, gravity pulls it down.
Yep.
It doesn't matter how we feel about the apple, right? The math is the math.
Precisely. But Riker argues that our modern institutions have been captured by a female-coded epistemology where feelings have literally replaced facts. Pathos has overthrown logos.
Right.
Under this framework, objective material conditions are increasingly irrelevant. Internal emotional states dictate reality.
He uses this phrase that really stuck with me. He says, the tier standard has replaced the gold standard.
It's a brilliant encapsulation of his point. Under gynocentric epistemology, Vulnerability has been weaponized into the ultimate social currency. The person who can convincingly perform the most trauma, the person who cries the loudest, or the demographic that claims the most historical or emotional injury automatically wins the argument.
Because their feelings are treated as facts.
Exactly. If an infant says they feel unsafe, that subjective internal feeling is no longer treated as an emotion to be managed. It is treated as an unquestionable objective fact that requires immediate intervention by the authorities to punish whoever supposedly made them feel that way, which is usually the predator.
To make this concrete for you listening, think about how this plays out in corporate HR or university policy. Riker ties this directly into his analysis of concept creep.
Yes.
It's a term from psychology that describes how words are stretched far beyond their original definitions to serve a new agenda. Historically, words like violence or harm had strict physical definitions. If someone punched you, that was violence.
Right.
Now, concept creep has expanded those definitions to include disagreeable speech, using the wrong pronouns, or simply causing someone emotional discomfort.
And the mechanics of that shift are deeply insidious. It transforms the natural, inevitable friction of living in a free, pluralistic society where people will inevitably disagree with you, offend you, or say things you don't like into a literal medical and legal emergency.
It's crazy when you frame it like that.
Think about the logic here. If speech you disagree with is categorized by the institution as literal violence because it raises an employee's cortisol levels, then the state or the HR department is completely justified in using actual physical force or financial ruin to stop that speech.
It's a linguistic trick.
It is. It justifies totalitarian control under the guise of merely protecting the infant from harm.
Riker uses a very specific high-profile media example to illustrate this exact infant versus predator framing. The Covington Catholic incident with Nicholas Sandmann from back in 2019.
Well, this is the perfect example.
I think everyone remembers the photo, but Riker breaks down the psychology of the media reaction.
He views the Sandmann incident as the absolute purest distillation of this pathology. Let's look at the objective, empirical reality of that event, the logos.
Okay.
You have a 16-year-old boy standing relatively still, smiling nervously, while an adult political activist approaches him, stands inches from his face, and beats a drum. But the media machine, operating entirely on this gynocentric grammar, instantly inverted the reality.
They framed the stoic teenage boy as the dangerous predator and the adult activist as the vulnerable infant.
They claimed the activist was being harmed by the boy's mere existence and his facial expression. The smirk was treated as an act of violence.
Even though the kid didn't do anything.
Exactly. Riker argues the media apparatus didn't care about the objective reality of the 2-hour video footage that exonerated the kids. They reacted purely to the ideological markers. Sandmann was wearing the Megray hat. He was white, he was male, he was Catholic. He represented traditional, masculine, religious competence and the old American order. Therefore, under the grammar of the left, he had to be destroyed. The objective facts only mattered after the defamation lawsuits forced them to matter.
But let me jump in here and genuinely challenge this premise. Riker is essentially describing a rigged societal courtroom where empirical data is thrown out and tears are the only admissible evidence.
That's his claim, yes.
But just look at the tone of his own book. It is highly charged. It is clearly furious. It uses inflammatory language like feral maternalism. By writing such an angry manifesto, doesn't the author risk using his own emotional anger to counter what he sees as emotional governance?
That's a fair point.
Isn't he just playing the exact same game of pathos, but just from the right-wing manosphere side of the political spectrum? If he loves logos so much, why is the book so angry?
That is a very sharp critique, and it goes right to the heart of his methodology. But if we dig into the text, Riker would argue that his anger is a response to a breach of logic, not a substitute for it. He doesn't just rant. He relies heavily throughout the text on syllogism, formal, logical arguments. He points to raw tax data, historical precedents, evolutionary biology, and mechanical engineering failures to build his case.
So the anger is secondary to the facts.
He views his work as a desperate defense of the logos. He argues that the substitution of consensus and hurt feelings for empirical verification is the literal death of Western knowledge. He's furious, yes, but he claims he is furious because the fundamental tools of reason, the very ability to state an objective fact, are being outlawed.
He's angry that the referee has thrown away the rule book.
Exactly.
That perfectly sets up the next major pillar of his argument, the war on competence. If this infant versus predator dynamic is the operating system of our culture, How does it actually manifest in the professional world?
It's everywhere.
How does it affect the physical infrastructure of our society? Because Riker claims this isn't just about hurt feelings on Twitter. He claims it manifests as a direct, almost suicidal war on competence itself.
And this is where he takes direct aim at the massive DEI industry, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Riker argues that DEI programs, despite their marketing, have absolutely nothing to do with fairness, justice, or historical righting of wrongs.
Then what are they about?
Instead, he frames them through the cold lens of evolutionary psychology as a mate-suppression strategy operating at a civilizational scale.
Mate-suppression. That is a heavy term from evolutionary biology. Walk us through how he applies that to corporate America.
Well, in evolutionary psychology, mate-suppression refers to tactics used by individuals or groups to lower the social status of a rival in order to reduce that rival's mating opportunities and resource access.
Okay.
Riker scales this concept up to the institutional level. He argues that the feral maternal hive mind, the collective bureaucracy driven by the safetyist ideology, perceives the highly competent, high-status, productive male not as a builder of civilization, but as a direct threat.
Why? Because he exposes them.
Precisely. Because the competent man sets a standard of excellence, a standard of logos that inevitably exposes the incompetence of the infant class. Therefore, the collective ego of the mediocrity class uses DEI mandates to drag the competent man down.
That's like crab bucket mentality.
It is the tall poppy syndrome codified into federal law and corporate HR policy. You chop down the tallest flower so the weeds don't feel bad about being short.
He calls this the equity tax. And he says this tax isn't just paid in lost profits, it is paid in blood. He uses some harrowing, highly technical examples to prove that when you abandon logos, people die. Let's look at the Florida International University Bridge collapse.
This happened in 2018. The FIU pedestrian bridge was a massive 950-ton concrete span that catastrophically collapsed onto a multi-lane highway, killing 6 people.
I remember seeing the footage of that. It was horrific.
Now, structural engineering is perhaps the ultimate domain of the logos. The physical universe does not care about your oppression ranking, your pronouns, or your diversity metrics. Gravity only cares the post-tensioning math is correct.
Right. Gravity doesn't negotiate.
Exactly. Riker attributes this collapse to a university and corporate culture where, in his words, lived experience and innovative inclusion supplanted the cold, unforgiving rigor of traditional masculine engineering. When an institution prioritizes demographic box-checking and public relations over rigorous, peer-reviewed competence, the bridge literally falls down.
He applies the exact same logic to the Boeing 737MX disasters, which killed 346 people.
Yeah.
For decades, Boeing was the gold standard of hardcore masculine engineering culture. Safety meant flawless mechanical design.
But Riker argues that Boeing was captured by a female-coded corporate culture focused on marketing, finance, short-term consensus, and DEI metrics. They tried to fix a physical aerodynamic hardware problem with a hidden software patch to the MCS system because it was cheaper and looked better on a spreadsheet.
And it drove planes into the ground.
It did. And the capture of aviation goes beyond just the manufacturers. Riker brings up a deeply concerning policy shift at the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, regarding how they hire air traffic controllers.
Oh man, this one is unbelievable. I mean, if there is any job that requires absolute elite cognitive competence, it is managing thousands of metal tubes flying at 500 miles per hour in a 3D spatial environment.
Exactly. For years, the FAA used a rigorous, science-based cognitive testing system called the ATSA. It reliably identified individuals capable of managing complex, high-stress spatial environments.
So it worked. It found the best people.
Yes. But because certain demographics, specifically white and Asian men, passed this test at higher rates, the bureaucracy deemed the test problematic. They scrapped the cognitive test entirely and replaced it with a biographical questionnaire.
And explain how absurd this questionnaire was, according to the book.
It actively penalized competence. Applicants literally received more points on their application for answering that their worst subject in high school was science, or that they played a lot of high school sports, than they did for having an actual pilot's license or an aviation degree.
Wait, really? Having a pilot's license got you fewer points than being bad at science?
Yes. Riker's point is devastating here. The system literally preferred to increase the risk of mid-air collisions rather than tolerate a demographic imbalance that naturally resulted from a meritocratic test. They traded actual safety for the emotional safety of equity.
He extends this war on physical reality to the military, which is the ultimate primal domain of life-or-death competence. He critiques the integration of women into frontline combat roles. specifically looking at the data from the Marine Corps Infantry Officer course.
Right. The Marines eventually allowed women to attempt this notoriously brutal, physically devastating training. For years, out of dozens of highly athletic women who tried, only 1 or 2 managed to pass.
And Riker highlights the institutional response.
Instead of acknowledging the biological reality that women, on average, have 40 to 60% less upper body strength, different skeletal angles that make load bearing under 100 pounds of gear highly destructive to their hips, and smaller lung capacities, the bureaucracy labeled the physical requirements of the course as barriers to inclusion.
They viewed the objective standard of lifting heavy gear, throwing a grenade a certain distance, and marching for 20 miles not as an absolute requirement for surviving a firefight against a male enemy,
but as an unfair, patriarchal obstacle.
because under the grammar of the left, if the infant can't pass the test itself must be inherently oppressive.
Exactly.
But here is the massive question you have to be asking yourself if you are listening to this. Let's assume Riker is right about the crab bucket mentality, where HR pulls down the high achievers. How does he explain the massive, overwhelming corporate buy-in for this? Why would profit-driven, cutthroat capitalist companies actively sabotage their own engineering, their own competence, and their own products? Why would Boeing want to build a bad plane?
That is the trillion-dollar question. If capitalism is about profit, why are they adopting policies that destroy value? Riker answers it with a concept he calls the institutional cowardice cascade. He argues that corporations comply not because they believe DEI makes them more profitable, but out of sheer, unadulterated terror. They are terrified of what he calls the GSR mechanism.
GSR gossip, shaming, rallying.
Yes. Riker identifies GSR as the traditional, evolutionary, female-coded social control strategy. Historically, men settled disputes through direct physical confrontation or explicit hierarchical competition.
Okay.
Women, who generally couldn't rely on physical dominance, evolved to resolve conflict and enforce norms through reputation destruction. Gossip to identify the target, shaming to punish them socially, and rallying the community to completely ostracize them.
So Riker argues that the modern corporate HR department is simply the gossip department, given a massive multi-million-dollar budget and federal legal authority.
Exactly.
So a CEO looks at a DEI mandate, knows it's garbage, knows it will hurt the company, but complies anyway.
Because corporations submit to these mandates out of fear of the liability lawsuits, the internal Slack channel rebellions, the Twitter mobs, and the total reputational destruction that the feral maternal hive mind will unleash upon them if they resist.
They choose the slow, managed death of incompetence over the sudden, violent death of being canceled.
It is cowardice disguised as corporate social responsibility.
But that institutional cowardice begs a much deeper question. If HR departments and safety bureaucrats are just acting on this feral maternal instinct to protect the infant, where is that instinct suddenly coming from in such massive quantities? Why now?
Oh, this is where it gets really deep.
This brings us to what I think is the most controversial, mind-bending premise of the entire book, the biological and chemical drivers. Riker looks directly at modern endocrinology and pharmaceuticals.
This is where he introduces the maternal surplus theory. This is the idea that the maternal instinct, the biological drive to nurture, to protect, to manage dependence, and to obsess over safety, is deeply hardwired into the female psyche through millions of years of mammalian evolution. But what happens when modern women, on a mass scale, delay motherhood until their late 30s, or reject it entirely in favor of corporate careers? Riker argues that this incredibly powerful ancient instinct doesn't just evaporate into thin air. It demands an outlet. The energy has to go somewhere.
The void has to be filled.
Precisely. And so women redirect this surplus maternal energy. On a micro level, they redirect it into pet hoarding, which perfectly explains the explosion of the fur baby industry, where dogs are treated literally as human infants with strollers and anxiety meds.
I've definitely seen that.
But on a macro civilizational level, they redirect this maternal energy into political power and bureaucracy. The childless bureaucrat treats the adult citizens of the state as her surrogate children. She manages their lives, she polices their speech for bad words, and she swaddles them in safety regulations.
Fulfilling her biological urge to mother, but directing it at the population instead of an actual infant.
Exactly.
But he goes deeper than just psychology. He claims there is a literal pharmacological disruption of the human endocrine system happening. He blames the contraceptive pill.
He does, and he cites several evolutionary biology studies to back this up, prominently the 2008 study by Alvernia and Lumau. This research investigated how hormonal contraception affects female mate choice.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of this.
Under natural ovulatory conditions, women's biology drives them to seek out major histocompatibility complex, or MHC, divergence.
Okay, break down MHC for us. What does that actually mean?
It relates to the immune system. In simple terms, biological women are naturally attracted to the scent of men who have genetically different immune systems from their own because combining divergent immune systems produces stronger, healthier offspring.
Makes evolutionary sense.
And these naturally attractive men tend to be highly masculine, rugged, traditional predators or builders in Riker's terminology. The famous sweaty t-shirt experiments prove this. Women smelled t-shirts worn by different men and consistently preferred the scent of men with divergent MHC genes.
But what happens when you introduce the pill?
The research suggests that hormonal birth control, because it essentially tricks the body into thinking it is already pregnant, completely chemically alters a woman's natural mate selection instincts.
Wow.
Instead of being attracted to highly masculine, genetically divergent men, women on hormonal birth control suddenly show a preference for the scent of men who are genetically similar to them, like family members. They prefer less masculine, more compliant, more agreeable men.
Riker refers to this as a literal chemical lobotomy of women's natural evolutionary mate selection. Society is being chemically re-engineered to prefer beta males.
That's his exact argument.
And the chemical disruption doesn't stop at attraction. He talks about cortisol.
Yes, cortisol is the primary stress hormone. It controls the fight or flight response. Riker cites endocrinology studies showing that women on hormonal birth control, and later those prescribed SSRI antidepressants to manage the resulting mood swings, exhibit chronically elevated cortisol levels.
So they're always stressed out.
They are chemically locked into a permanent state of threat detection. So, according to Riker, you have a massive demographic of women whose own biology is constantly tricking them into feeling threatened. They literally feel like they are in danger all the time, leading them to view the world as a fundamentally hostile place full of predators that must be controlled.
Which leads directly to his argument about demographic suicide. If women are delaying marriage, taking hormones that make them stressed, and rejecting masculine men, the birth rates plummet.
Unavoidably.
He points out that birth rates across the entire Western world have collapsed well below the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. You look at places like South Korea, where it's down to a catastrophic 0.72, the math means the society is literally dying.
And this ties directly back to his political thesis. Riker argues that these single, childless, highly stressed women are compensating for the void in their lives by voting as a bloc for a massive, all-encompassing nanny state.
If they do not have a traditional husband to provide resources, build a home, and offer physical protection, they vote for the government to step into that exact role.
The state becomes the surrogate husband. The government provides the housing, the healthcare, and the income, all funded by tax resources extracted from the productive, masculine male class.
I really want you, the listener, to think about the sheer staggering scale of this claim for a second. Riker is arguing that the entire progressive welfare state, the trillions of dollars, the massive government agencies, the sweeping cultural shifts of the last 50 years is essentially the downstream result of a pharmacological disruption of the female endocrine system.
It's a huge claim.
But let me challenge this heavily. By making this argument, isn't Riker stripping women of their intellectual agency? He's reducing deeply held political, philosophical, and moral beliefs about equality and social safety entirely to hormones, birth control, and barren wombs. Isn't that an incredibly deterministic, almost insulting view of half the population?
It is fiercely deterministic, and you're right to point that out, but Riker is completely unapologetic about it. He fundamentally rejects the idea that modern progressive leftism is a coherent intellectual or political philosophy.
So he thinks they didn't just read a book and decide to be leftists.
No, he doesn't think they read Marx and arrived at a logical conclusion. He views it strictly as a biological misfire. In his framework, safetyism is a collective mental illness. It is an evolutionary suicide pact where society is trading its future existence, its literal genetic continuity, for the present emotional comfort of a medicated, highly anxious, childless demographic.
He doesn't believe he's stripping them of agency. He believes he is finally exposing the biological strings that have been pulling their ideological puppets all along.
That's exactly how he frames it.
Armed with this pharmacological and psychological framework, Riker then maps out exactly how specific pillars of our society were deliberately captured and transformed into what he calls nurseries. Let's start with education, because he says the history of how schools used to function compared to now is the clearest proof of this capture.
Oh, the education chapter is fascinating. Riker argues that the classical education model, which was demanding, hierarchical, and based on objective mastery of subjects, has been entirely feminized.
The modern classroom has been turned into a gynocentric echo chamber that actively pathologizes normal male behavior.
Yes. And he uses a seemingly small but highly symbolic example: the nationwide educational campaign to ban red ink when grading student papers.
Right, because teachers were told that seeing red ink causes trauma and emotional distress to the student.
Exactly. Riker views this as the ultimate prioritization of the infant's feelings over the objective truth of their academic performance. Using a purple or green pen to soften the blow teaches the child that their emotional comfort is actually more important than the accuracy of their work. It's an assault on the logos.
But it goes beyond just grading. He talks about the physical changes to the school environment, the elimination of recess, the banning of games like dodgeball, tag, or British bulldog because they are deemed too competitive or aggressive.
And historically, the playground was the crucial arena where boys establish hierarchies through rough and tumble play.
Yeah.
It's where they learn to manage physical risk, negotiate rules without adult interference, and deal with losing. By removing that physical outlet, the school system insists that boys must sit completely still in a desk for 8 hours a day and process information in a highly passive, female-coded manner.
And when boys naturally fail to do this because their biology demands movement, the system doesn't adjust its methods. It declares the boys biologically defective.
Which leads to the staggering statistics he cites about medication. Riker points out that boys are diagnosed with ADHD and drugged with amphetamines at more than twice the rate of girls.
He argues the medical industry is effectively sedating the male mind into docility just to make the classroom easier to manage for a female-dominated teaching profession.
And this flows seamlessly into his broader critique of the mental health industry. He claims we have completely medicalized normal human existence.
Break that down. What does he mean by medicalizing normality?
Well, historically, the West relied on traditional rites of passage difficult challenges that forged character through adversity and failure. In their place, we have installed a therapeutic state.
Okay.
Normal human emotions, deep sadness over the loss of a loved one, severe anxiety before a big public challenge, or just the natural restlessness and rebellion of youth are no longer seen as inherent conditions of life to be endured, integrated, and overcome.
So what are they seen as now?
Well, the DSM, the psychiatric manual, has expanded so massively that all of these normal states are now pathologized as clinical disorders requiring lifelong pharmaceutical management. Riker argues that in the modern grammar of the left, a psychiatric diagnosis has become a VIP pass in the oppression Olympics.
It exempts the individual from accountability, from expectation, and from competition. Victimhood has transitioned from a temporary state of misfortune into a protected, celebrated, permanent identity.
Precisely.
Then we get to family law and domestic violence, and this chapter is absolutely brutal. To prove how ideology captured the legal system, he takes a deep dive into the Duluth model.
The Duluth model, created in Minnesota in the 1980s, is the prevailing framework for domestic violence intervention used by police departments across the Western world. Riker attacks it aggressively because it is not based on empirical data. It explicitly assumes, as a starting premise, that all domestic violence is rooted in male patriarchal terrorism intended to exert control over women.
It is a purely ideological framework.
Yes, it preassumes male guilt and female innocence, regardless of the physical evidence at the scene.
And to prove just how deep this ideological capture goes, he recounts the history of Erin Peetsy. If you listening don't know who she is, she founded Chiswick Women's Aid, the very first modern domestic violence shelter in the UK back in 1971. By all accounts, she should be celebrated as a feminist icon.
She should be on a stamp. But she was excommunicated from the very movement she helped create. When Peetsy opened her shelter, she expected to find innocent women fleeing tyrannical men. But through observing the women in her shelter over years, she realized a dark empirical truth: domestic violence was very often mutual. In many of the cases, the women themselves were highly aggressive and mutually violent.
And when Peetsy tried to report this empirical truth, arguing that violence is a cyclical, human psychological issue, not strictly a male patriarchal issue, the response from the feminist establishment was terrifying.
She didn't just get canceled, she received credible bomb threats. Activists literally shot her dog. She had to flee the country for her own safety.
Riker uses her story as the ultimate proof that the safety industrial complex does not actually care about safety or truth. It only cares about maintaining the infant predator binary. Because Pizzi tried to introduce Logos empirical evidence that women can also be predators, she had to be destroyed.
Exactly.
And he scales this infant mentality all the way up to the university system, which he calls the ultimate nursery state. He brings up the University of Utah actually installing a cry closet in the library during finals week.
Oh, that was real.
I thought this was a joke when I read it, but it's real. It was a literal, dark, padded booth filled with plush toys where stressed college students, legal adults, could go to weep and suck their thumbs because taking a test was too traumatic.
It's astonishing.
And returning to family law, he argues the legal standard of the best interest of the child is actually just a weaponized wealth transfer mechanism.
It is designed to render the biological father legally and economically redundant. The family court system extracts the father's wealth through punitive child support and alimony, while the state welfare check and the mother replace his actual authority in the home.
It physically severs the father from the family unit, leaving the child entirely dependent on the state and the mother, completing the feral maternal monopoly on power.
That's the argument, yes.
Let me ask you to consider the mechanics of this. Riker paints a picture of a school-to-prison-to-welfare pipeline, and he says it's entirely driven by this state-sponsored intentional fatherlessness. It's like society decided to deliberately dynamite the load-bearing pillars of a house, the fathers, and then the government hands out hard hats to the kids to deal with the collapsing roof, claiming they are the saviors.
That's a great analogy.
But does he offer any concrete historical proof that the state intentionally designed this to destroy men, rather than it just being a tragic, accidental byproduct of the sexual revolution and well-intentioned but flawed welfare programs like Title 4D?
Riker navigates this by arguing it is a synthesis of both conscious intent and unconscious archetype. He certainly points to early Marxist and radical feminist literature that explicitly called for the destruction of the nuclear family as a necessary step to dismantle capitalism and patriarchy, so the ideological architects knew exactly what they were doing. But more profoundly, he argues it is the natural, instinctual outcome of the terrible mother archetype taking over the apparatus of the state. When the government assumes the role of the omnipotent provider and mother, it inherently views the independent authoritative father as a competing power structure.
The feral mother doesn't want the father around because the father introduces risk, he introduces discipline, and crucially, he introduces the child's eventual separation from the mother's control.
Exactly. So, whether directed by conscious malice or unconscious instinct, the bureaucratic system inevitably acts to destroy the father to maintain its total control over the children.
Which brings us perfectly to the money. All of these captured institutions, the millions of HR professionals, the university cry closets, the massive welfare state, the subsidies, they require astronomical, mind-boggling amounts of funding. Who pays for it?
Well, Riker argues it is funded by a highly targeted tax on the very male competence the system despises.
He introduces the concepts of the testosterone tax and the risk tax. Riker points to stark, undeniable economic data to make this point. For example, he cites tax statistics from the UK demonstrating that men pay approximately 72% of all income tax collected by the state, while simultaneously consuming only about 36% of the welfare expenditure.
So the math is incredibly lopsided. Men are paying the vast majority of the bill and using almost none of the safety net services.
Precisely. And he expands this to the concept of the net negative taxpayer democracy. When economists calculate lifetime fiscal impact, meaning they look at a citizen's lifetime tax contributions versus their lifetime consumption of government services, healthcare, and infrastructure, a stark gender divide appears.
Women, on average, largely due to a combination of greater lifespan, lower lifetime earnings, more time out of the workforce, and significantly higher utilization of healthcare and social safety nets, receive trillions of dollars more in government services over their lives than they ever pay in taxes.
Men, conversely, pay trillions of dollars more into the system than they ever extract.
He views this as the ultimate beta-orbiter dynamic playing out at a geopolitical level. For the listeners familiar with manosphere terminology, you know exactly what he means.
Yes, in those communities, a beta orbiter is defined as a man who provides resources, attention, and favors to a woman who has no intention of reciprocating romantically or sexually, but he continues to orbit her, hoping to eventually win her favor or simply avoid her wrath.
Riker argues the modern government operates as the ultimate beta orbiter on behalf of women. The state forcefully extracts wealth from high-value, productive, risk-taking men, the predators in the leftist grammar, through progressive taxation.
It then uses that confiscated wealth to subsidize the lives of the infant class and single childless women, essentially buying their votes with the men's money. It is a systematic and forced wealth transfer from the risk-bearing builders to the risk-averse consumers.
And he claims that when tax revenue isn't enough to cover the massive costs of this nursery state, the government manages the anxiety of governance through retail therapy.
Just like an anxious person might max out a credit card on shopping to soothe their emotional distress, the government just turns on the printing press. He points to the catastrophic national debt over $34 trillion in the United States alone as empirical proof that the state is operating on female-coded emotional self-harm rather than masculine actuarial fiscal logic.
Because the hive mother fundamentally cannot bear to say the word no to the demands of the infant class. Saying no causes emotional distress. So rather than enforcing fiscal discipline, balancing a budget and cutting services, she simply prints the money.
She destroys the purchasing power of the currency through inflation, hiding the true cost of her safetyism from the public.
I want to go back to Riker's metaphor of the buck and the tick. He says the productive, risk-taking male is the strong buck running through the forest, and the bloated, regulatory, DEI-obsessed bureaucracy is the parasitic tick attached to his neck, draining his blood.
What happens when the tick drains too much? Does the author believe the economy will slowly, gently stagnate into a sort of managed Japanese-style decline? Or does he predict a sudden, catastrophic collapse?
Riker unequivocally predicts a catastrophic collapse. He believes that the demographic debt, the sheer lack of children being born to replace the aging population, and the financial debt, the $34 trillion of printed money, are on a high-speed collision course.
His logic is simple. You simply cannot fund a massive, ever-expanding welfare state while simultaneously demonizing, overtaxing, and regulating out of existence the very risk-taking behavior and masculine competence required to generate the wealth that sustains it.
Eventually, the buck collapses from exhaustion, and when the host dies, the tick dies with it.
So, with the diagnosis complete and the collapse supposedly imminent, what is the prescription? How does the author tell his male readers to survive, navigate, and eventually reverse this civilizational decline?
Riker calls for a total, unapologetic reclamation of the logos. He urges men to aggressively return to the masculine principles of objective truth, reason, mathematical reality, and natural law. And practically, he advocates for building what he calls a fortress of sanity.
Meaning, stop trying to fix the broken system, build parallel structures instead.
Exactly. He tells his readers to abandon the delusion that they can reform institutions, universities, legacy media, corporate HR that are already entirely captured and hollowed out by the safety industrial complex.
Instead, they must build parallel structures. They need to create new educational agoras, alternative decentralized financial systems, and private intentional communities that exist entirely outside the reach of the feral maternal state.
And central to this survival strategy is what he calls the helmets off doctrine.
The helmets off doctrine is his philosophical call for men to deliberately embrace danger, physical struggle, and risk as the essential forge of masculine character. In a society that demands you bubble wrap yourself and live in a state of constant anxiety, choosing to do hard things becomes a profound act of political rebellion.
Starting a business without a safety net, engaging in physically demanding combat sports, speaking from within empirical truths without a filter. These are all ways of rejecting the nanny state's control over your mind and body.
He places a massive emphasis on the power of the word no, simply refusing to apologize.
Yes. He tells men they must refuse to attend the corporate diversity seminars. They must refuse to use mandated pronouns that contradict biological reality. They must refuse to comply with the linguistic seatbelts that the left uses to control thought.
The progressive system, he argues, relies entirely on the compliance and the cowardly apologies of the competent. Riker argues that if a critical mass of competent men simply say no and refuse to apologize for their competence or their masculinity, the entire shaming mechanism, the GSR, the gossip, shaming, rallying, loses all of its power.
The mob only has power if you agree to feel ashamed.
He also calls for the intellectual arming of men through the restoration of the trivium.
The trivium comprising grammar, logic, and rhetoric. This was the absolute foundation of classical Western education for 2 millennia before it was dismantled. Riker views the trivium as an intellectual immune system against emotional manipulation.
Walk us through how that works practically. If someone says words are violence, how does the trivium defeat that?
Step 1 is grammar. Grammar establishes the objective facts and definitions of reality. You define words as sounds representing ideas, and violence as physical force causing physical injury.
Okay, that makes sense.
Step 2 is logic. Logic builds understanding from those facts without emotional bias. You apply the syllogism. Since words lack physical force, they cannot commit physical violence.
Right.
Step 3 is rhetoric. Rhetoric is the ability to communicate that logical truth persuasively to an audience. Riker argues that mastering the trivium makes a man completely immune to the emotional manipulation, the concept creep, and the intersectionality nonsense of the modern university. They can't trick you if you know how to think.
Think about what this means for you, the listener, in your own life. Riker is essentially saying that true freedom requires the willingness to fail, to bleed, to be offended, and to face the harsh consequences of reality without running to a bureaucratic mother for help.
But let's look at the practical application here.
Isn't there a severe risk that by completely rejecting the mainstream nursery, by pulling their kids out of public schools and leaving corporate jobs to build these fortresses of sanity, these men just isolate themselves? Don't they end up in their own hyper-masculine echo chambers, losing all influence over the broader culture and just ceding the territory to the bureaucrats?
It's the classic historical tension between reform from within and total secession. But Riker concludes that what he is advocating for isn't isolation. It is a strategic secession from a dying empire.
He believes the mainstream culture is already terminal. The math simply doesn't work anymore.
By pulling their children from public schools, by starving the tech attention economy of their data, and by intentionally rebuilding traditional patriarchal hierarchies within their own parallel communities, these men are not hiding. They are building an arc.
They are preserving the flame of Western civilization, ensuring that when the current system inevitably collapses under the sheer weight of its own economic, demographic, and biological delusions, there will be a cadre of highly competent, reality-grounded men ready to rebuild society from the ashes.
That is a heavy, monumental journey we've just been on. To summarize Riker's sweeping view, we are looking at a civilization that he believes is being actively strangled to death by feral maternalism, chemically numbed by pharmaceutical intervention, and engaged in a suicidal war against the very male competence, risk-taking, and objective truth that built it.
It is a stark, uncompromising, and deeply challenging vision of our present reality, and it leaves us with a profound philosophical dilemma to consider as we close.
If the ultimate goal of the safety industrial complex is the complete and total elimination of all risk, and yet existence, progress, and joy inherently require risk, is a perfectly safe society, actually just a society that has stopped living altogether.
Wow. If you eliminate the chance of death, you eliminate the possibility of life.
Exactly. So I ask you, the listener, what risks are you avoiding right now in your own life, your career, or your relationships, simply because society told you it was unsafe?
That is a hell of a question to leave off on. Let me tell you, to truly understand the incredible depth of these arguments, the deep dives into evolutionary biology, the economic tax data, and the history of our institutions before this ideological capture, you absolutely need to read the source material directly. We barely scratched the surface of the data he provides. You need to read Conrad Riker's words for yourself.
It is the only way to fully grasp the intricate architecture of his argument and the history he uncovers.
So I highly encourage you, the listener, to go check out Amazon, Kindle, and Google Playbooks right now to buy Safety Industrial Complex by Conrad Riker. And be sure to follow the author for more of these incredible insights at Conrad and Riker on Substack.
I promise you, it will fundamentally change the way you look at the regulations, the corporate mandates, and the institutions in your everyday life.
As always, a final reminder to please like and subscribe to the show for more of these custom-tailored deep dive explorations. We broke down the walls of the pastel-colored daycare today. Keep learning, keep questioning the safety rails, and we'll see you next time.